Michael Turner moved through the heart of the bustling downtown streets, his eyes set on the path ahead, but his mind already at the community center where a critical meeting awaited him. Just a few months ago, he had made history by becoming the first black governor of the state, an achievement that still carried a powerful weight in his heart. For Michael, this role was not merely political, it was deeply personal. He had always seen himself as a bridge between communities, a voice for those who were often unheard, and his campaign had been dedicated to connecting with people across all backgrounds. He wore a calm, approachable expression as he greeted people passing by. Some recognized him, smiling back with a mixture of surprise and pride. He could tell that many of them had probably seen him only on the news, in his suit and tie, with the title of governor beneath his name. Today, though, he was dressed casually, blending in with the crowd in a simple sweater and jeans, hoping to keep a low profile. Despite his attempts, the streets of this neighborhood were his roots, and people noticed him with respectful nods and waves. The memories of his own upbringing in a nearby neighborhood flooded back to him with each familiar street he walked down. Michael had grown up with humble beginnings, raised by parents who, despite their limited means, had instilled in him an unshakable commitment to education, integrity, and hard work. They had shown him that resilience was a silent strength, and from a young age, he had been determined to make something of himself. He knew all too well the challenges that came with being black in this society, the prejudices, the unfair assumptions, the need to always prove oneself. Yet, those obstacles had only sharpened his determination. As he walked, he couldn't help but think of the changes he was now in a position to bring about. Today's meeting was one of the most important he had planned since taking office. Community leaders from across the city would be gathered at the center to discuss urgent topics: police reform, educational opportunities, and economic initiatives that he wanted to see implemented. Michael felt the weight of his responsibility as he neared the building. Yet he was fueled by the knowledge that he was here for a purpose bigger than himself. Lost in thought, he barely noticed the police car parked a few blocks ahead. The two officers inside watched him as he approached, their gaze lingering with an intensity that was hard to ignore. Michael sensed their eyes on him, but he continued walking, nodding politely as he passed. He had grown accustomed to these moments, to the scrutiny that seemed to follow him no matter where he went. But something about their look felt different today, as though they were assessing him. Suddenly, he heard the car door slam behind him, and he turned slightly, watching as one of the officers began to approach him with quick strides. Michael instinctively slowed his pace, not wanting to escalate the situation, but unsure why they had taken such interest in him. "Excuse me, sir," the officer called, his voice sharp and authoritative. "Can you stop right there?" Michael stopped, looking at the officer with a steady gaze, offering a calm but questioning expression. "Good afternoon, officer. Is there a problem?" The officer exchanged a look with his partner, who had also stepped out of the car now, crossing his arms and surveying Michael with a stern frown. There was an unmistakable edge in their stances, something that felt out of place in what should have been a routine interaction. "Mind if we ask what you're doing around here?" the first officer demanded, his tone cold. Michael paused, choosing his words carefully. "I'm on my way to a meeting with some community leaders. It's just down the street at the center." The officers exchanged another glance, skepticism clear on their faces. The second officer took a step closer. "Do you have any ID on you?" The question stung, though Michael managed to keep his composure. He was well aware that many people of color face similar interactions daily, being asked to prove their right to be somewhere. The irony wasn't lost on him. He was the governor, yet here he was questioned in a neighborhood where he had once felt most at home. "Yes, of course," he replied, reaching slowly into his pocket. He produced his wallet, pulling out his ID, which clearly displayed his full name and title. He extended it toward the officer, who barely glanced at it, his face twisted in a mixture of disbelief and irritation. "That's a nice story," the officer said with a sneer. "But you don't exactly look like a governor." Michael took a deep breath, choosing to stay calm. "I assure you, officer, I am Michael Turner, the governor of this state. I'm here because I have an important meeting about issues that affect this community, including public safety." The first officer scoffed. "You think we're just going to take your word for it?" His tone was mocking, almost daring Michael to argue. The second officer snatched the ID from his hand, examining it with a look of distrust before tossing it back. "Why don't you come with us?" the officer suggested, his hand moving subtly toward his belt. Michael felt a surge of frustration, but kept his expression neutral. He knew better than to argue or resist. Years of experience had taught him the risks of escalating situations with law enforcement. So he nodded, still holding on to his calm, his mind racing with frustration and disbelief as they motioned for him to move toward their vehicle. Mark Turner took a slow breath, attempting to keep his composure despite the rising frustration. The officers hadn't let up. They were determined to treat him as a threat, ignoring his explanations and brushing off his identity as the newly elected governor. He recognized the tension in the air, the hostility that radiated from these officers who saw him as someone out of place, even though he was the highest-ranking official in the state. One of the officers, Officer Brown, moved closer, his hand resting on his utility belt. "Why don't you come with us, sir?" he said, his voice laden with sarcasm. "We'll verify this governor's story back at the station." Mark felt his pulse quicken. Going to the station was unnecessary. He'd made his identity clear, and it was evident that they just didn't want to believe him. Calmly, he repeated, "I'm the governor of this state, and I have an important meeting just down this street. There is no need to take me anywhere." Officer Brown chuckled, exchanging a look with his partner, Officer Smith, who shrugged with a smirk. "That's cute, but that ID of yours could be fake," Smith retorted. "We'll need to check you out just to be sure." Mark's face remained calm, though inside, he felt a knot of anger. It wasn't the first time he'd been doubted, but he had hoped that his new role would offer a shield against these types of assumptions. He was about to respond when he noticed his assistant, Jake, emerging from a nearby building, his face lined with worry as he took in the scene. Jake hurried over, glancing between Mark and the officers, his voice tight with concern. "Excuse me, officers. This is Mark Turner, the governor of the state. I'm his assistant. There's absolutely no reason to detain him. He has a meeting to attend in just a few minutes." The officers exchanged incredulous looks, clearly unsure how to proceed. Finally, Officer Brown scoffed, "Nice story. But if he's really the governor, then let's call it in. Let's verify." Mark stood in silence, his expression one of measured restraint. Jake quickly pulled out his phone, dialing the state office. The seconds dragged as Jake spoke to the staffer on the other end, confirming Mark's identity. At last, he handed the phone to Officer Brown, who reluctantly took it. After a brief exchange, Officer Brown's face went pale. He looked at Mark with widened eyes, his previous smirk replaced by a look of disbelief. The officer returned the phone to Jake, who gave him a knowing look, holding his ground beside Mark. Mark stood tall, his gaze steady as he looked at the officers. "Now, can I get on with my business?" he asked, his tone firm. Both officers nodded, their faces flushed with embarrassment, mumbling a hasty apology before stepping aside. Mark didn't waste another second. He nodded to Jake and continued toward his meeting, his thoughts a mixture of disappointment and resolve. Mark Turner sat in the boardroom, the bustling energy around him contrasting sharply with his own quiet turmoil. Only hours had passed since his encounter with the police, yet it felt like a lifetime. His thoughts were tangled, looping back to the hostility he'd faced on what was supposed to be just another walk to work. Today was meant to be a defining day for his administration, one that he'd hoped would focus on economic and social issues. Now, however, it seemed destined to be overshadowed by an incident he hadn't asked for, but one that was all too common for men like him. The meeting was already underway, with his team diving into agendas and proposals, each member oblivious to the personal battle he was fighting. He clenched his hands under the table, forcing himself to concentrate, to be the leader they expected. His head of policy, Vanessa, was midway through outlining an ambitious housing initiative, detailing the proposed funding breakdown and projected impact on local communities. Normally, Mark would be asking questions, engaged and energized, but today, her words felt like static. The room was suddenly interrupted as Jake, Mark's assistant, stepped in, his face taut. He moved quietly to Mark's side, leaning down to speak in a low tone. "Mark, the media caught wind of what happened this morning. They're asking for an official statement. They want to know why the newly elected governor was stopped by police and why it got physical." Mark took a deep breath, steeling himself. He'd anticipated the scrutiny, even the backlash, but he hadn't expected it so soon. His administration was barely off the ground, and already he was on the defensive. He gave Jake a nod, silently dismissing him, then turned his attention back to the room, though his mind was now racing with the reality of what lay ahead. Clearing his throat, Mark spoke up, his voice steady but carrying an edge that his team couldn't ignore. "I want to address something before we go any further." He met the eyes of each person at the table, their expressions shifting as they sensed the gravity of his tone. "This morning, I was detained on my way here by the police." A murmur spread through the room, a mixture of disbelief and anger reflected in their faces. Vanessa looked stunned, her hand frozen mid-gesture, while Tom, his communications director, tightened his grip on his notebook. "Governor, what happened?" Tom asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "They claimed I looked suspicious," Mark replied, his jaw tightening as he recalled the officer's words. "I was treated with suspicion, as if my mere presence was a threat. It didn't matter to them who I was, or that I was heading to a meeting that concerned the future of this state. What mattered to them was that I looked out of place." His team sat in silence, absorbing the weight of his words. He could feel their outrage mingling with his own, the unspoken question hanging heavy in the air. How could this happen to the governor? Mark continued, his voice growing stronger. "This isn't just about me. This is about something bigger, something that affects people across this state every single day. I won't let it go unanswered, but I also won't let it become a distraction. We have a job to do here, and I intend to get it done." He turned to Tom, who had already started scribbling notes. "We'll need a statement. Something clear, calm, but firm. I want the people to understand that I am committed to justice, not just for myself, but for everyone. No grandstanding, no finger-pointing. Just the facts." Tom nodded, a determined look in his eyes. "Understood, Governor. I'll draft something immediately." Mark leaned back, feeling a flicker of satisfaction as he watched his team spring into action. They were on his side, ready to fight with him. But he knew this was only the beginning. The media would want more than a simple statement. They'd dig into every detail, scrutinize every moment of the encounter. And the public, they would look to him for strength, for resilience. He was no longer just Mark Turner, the man who'd been wronged. He was Mark Turner, the governor, a symbol for those who faced injustices but didn't have a platform. As the meeting resumed, Mark felt a renewed sense of purpose. This wasn't the way he'd envisioned the day, but perhaps it was the way it needed to be. By early afternoon, Mark's statement had gone live. What started as a routine morning for him had exploded into a full-blown national controversy. News outlets picked up the story immediately, with headlines like "Newly elected governor detained by police in unprovoked incident" plastered across major platforms. Television commentators, online journalists, and social media users reacted to Mark's story with a mixture of outrage and frustration, seeing his experience as the latest example of how deeply embedded racial profiling remained within law enforcement. Mark sat in his office, exhausted but aware he had to stay present. His team buzzed with activity as messages flooded in from other politicians, journalists, and even civil rights organizations. Some leaders expressed genuine concern, offering to support him however he needed. Others seemed more motivated by political opportunity, eager to align themselves with the trending issue. Civil rights groups, always vigilant for moments to spark public consciousness, saw Mark's story as a rallying cry and amplified it widely across social media. rallying supporters and advocates from across the country. By evening, hashtags in support of Mark were trending nationwide. News channels displayed his face alongside commentary about the ongoing issues of racial profiling and the challenges black men faced, even those in positions of power. For many, this wasn't about one governor's bad experience. It was a painful reminder of a shared reality. People voiced their anger, others shared their own stories, and the national conversation deepened and intensified by the minute. Back in his office, Mark met with his core team, surrounded by screens showing live news coverage of the incident. The room was charged with a mixture of urgency and resolve. Vanessa, Mark's head of policy, broke the silence, her expression fierce and determined. "Governor, this isn't just news. It's an opportunity," she began, her tone steady. "We have a rare moment here, something we can turn into a real push for change. If we're careful, we can introduce actual policies to start addressing the problem of racial profiling in this state." Mark nodded, his mind racing with both frustration and purpose. This was not how he had wanted to launch his administration's reform agenda, but he couldn't ignore the momentum building around him. "I agree, Vanessa, but we need to be strategic. This can't come off as just a reactionary measure to what happened to me today. If we want real reform, we have to make this about the people, not just the governor." Tom, Mark's communications director, leaned forward. "People are paying attention, Governor. This is one of those rare times when the public and the press are in sync with what we're feeling. But it's a thin line to walk. We can't look like we're exploiting your experience for political gain. It has to be clear we're trying to do the right thing." Mark sighed, taking in the weight of what lay ahead. He'd always known that being a black governor would bring unique challenges, but he hadn't anticipated needing to address such a personal attack on his identity this soon. "You're right, Tom. We keep it factual, we stay professional, and we focus on what we can do to help others avoid this." He looked around the room, meeting the eyes of each of his team members. "Let's draft a policy proposal on police accountability and transparency. Something that shows we're taking this seriously and that we're committed to making a difference. No empty promises." Jake, his assistant, who had been quietly observing the exchange, finally spoke up, his voice steady but concerned. "Governor, your story has moved a lot of people today, but it's also stirred up a lot of emotions. I'm hearing that the police department is feeling the pressure, and honestly, they're not taking it well." Mark's face hardened. "They should be feeling the pressure, Jake. This isn't just about what happened to me. It's about what happens to thousands of others across this state who don't have the platform or the resources to speak up. But we'll keep it professional. I don't want this to turn into some kind of spectacle. We keep our response above board, grounded in facts. That way, no one can accuse us of being divisive." The team exchanged nods, each member grasping the significance of Mark's words. They began brainstorming and drafting a comprehensive set of proposals, aiming to create a package of reforms that emphasized officer accountability. This meant proposals to address racial profiling through mandatory reporting, enhanced officer training on racial sensitivity, and enforcing real consequences for misconduct. Mark wanted these changes to have impact, not just as a statement, but as a policy framework that would set the standard for true change. As the discussions continued late into the evening, Mark felt the weight of his role more acutely than ever. He was not just a figurehead. He was now a symbol for many people who'd faced similar struggles in silence. He felt the burden of their hopes on his shoulders and a renewed determination to use his position to create meaningful change. Finally, as the team packed up for the night, Mark took a moment to himself. He gazed out the window, looking over the city lights and feeling a quiet resolve settle within him. This job had become something far bigger than he'd anticipated. He hadn't chosen to become a symbol of resistance, but he understood now that he couldn't turn away from it. His duty was not only to govern, but to confront and challenge the deep-seated issues that plagued his state, and by extension his country. In the silence, Mark closed his eyes, reflecting on the weight of what lay ahead. For so many years, he had fought hard to reach this position, and now, standing on this unexpected battleground, he realized just how critical it was to remain unwavering. This was his opportunity, perhaps his responsibility, to be the governor who didn't just lead, but who stood for justice and equity. The following days were a whirlwind for Mark. Media coverage of the incident intensified, and protests erupted across the state in support of the newly elected governor. Activists rallied outside police departments, demanding accountability and reform. Mark was both heartened and overwhelmed by the passionate response. It was clear that the incident had struck a nerve and that people were ready for change. Mark scheduled a press conference to address the situation directly. He wanted to take control of the narrative and set the tone for the reforms he planned to introduce. As he stood in front of the cameras, flanked by his team, he felt the weight of expectation. His hands were steady, but his heart raced. "Thank you all for being here," he began, his voice resonating with determination. "What happened to me was not an isolated incident. It reflects a much larger issue that affects countless individuals in our state and across the nation. Today, we stand at a crossroads. We can choose to remain silent, or we can choose to raise our voices and demand change." As he spoke, he noticed the diverse audience, supporters, skeptics, and even a few detractors among the crowd. He took a deep breath, channeling the energy of those who had rallied behind him. "I want to assure everyone that my administration will prioritize police reform. We will introduce comprehensive policies aimed at holding law enforcement accountable, ensuring transparency, and fostering better community relations." The applause that followed was mixed with shouts of agreement and dissent. Mark knew that he couldn't please everyone, but he remained focused on his vision. "We will establish an independent review board to oversee police conduct, mandate de-escalation training for officers, and implement community policing initiatives. These steps are just the beginning of a much-needed transformation." As he stepped away from the podium, he felt a sense of accomplishment wash over him. But that feeling was short-lived. The backlash came quickly. Later that evening, Mark received a flurry of messages. Some were supportive, but many were filled with anger and resentment. Critics accused him of using the incident to gain political leverage, claiming that his administration was overreaching and undermining law enforcement. In the days that followed, a prominent local talk radio host used his platform to stir up discontent. "Governor Turner is turning against the very people who protect us," he shouted. "He's playing the race card to push his agenda. We cannot let this stand." The host's words resonated with a segment of the population, leading to further protests against Mark's administration. Mark felt the tension rising as he watched the protests unfold on the news. Supporters of the police clashed with demonstrators advocating for reform. He understood that navigating this storm would require not only courage, but also a deep commitment to dialogue. He called an emergency meeting with his team to discuss their next steps. "Look, the pushback is real," Mark said as he leaned against the conference table, addressing his team. "We need to be prepared for the fallout. We have to show people that our intentions are genuine. This is about making our communities safer, not vilifying the police." Vanessa, always the strategist, nodded in agreement. "We should consider hosting community forums, places where citizens can voice their concerns and we can listen. It's essential for us to engage with everyone, including those who oppose our initiatives." Tom chimed in, "That's a great idea. We can't afford to alienate anyone. We need to demonstrate that we're not just making unilateral decisions, but rather fostering a collaborative approach to reform." As they discussed logistics, Mark felt a surge of determination. He was acutely aware that they were treading on delicate ground, but the potential for real change invigorated him. "Let's set up these forums, but let's also ensure we have experts present. People who can speak to the benefits of reform and address any misconceptions head-on." Over the next few weeks, Mark's administration worked tirelessly to organize these community meetings. They took place in various locations around the state, from community centers to city halls. Mark knew the importance of showing up and being present, so he committed to attending as many as possible. He wanted people to see that he was genuinely interested in their thoughts and experiences. The first forum was held in a packed auditorium in downtown. As he entered, the murmurs of the crowd shifted to a tense silence. Mark could feel the weight of their gazes. He stepped up to the microphone, his heart pounding. "Thank you all for coming today," he said, his voice steady. "This is an opportunity for us to have an open dialogue. I want to hear your concerns and your ideas because this is about our community and I am committed to making it better for everyone." The first few questions were direct and challenging. Some attendees criticized him for what they perceived as an attack on law enforcement. Others voiced their frustration over rising crime rates and expressed a desire for more police presence in their neighborhoods. Mark listened intently, taking notes as he engaged with each speaker. "I hear you," he responded to one woman who had expressed her fear of crime. "I want to assure you that our approach to reform doesn't mean we're defunding the police. Instead, we are investing in better training, better community relations, and ensuring our officers have the resources they need to serve you effectively." Slowly, the mood in the room began to shift. Mark noticed nods of understanding, and some attendees even began to share their own experiences with the police. It became evident that many people felt unheard, and Mark made it his mission to ensure their voices were valued. By the end of the forum, while not everyone agreed with him, Mark felt he had made strides in building bridges. He was grateful for the opportunity to connect with people personally, and he left the auditorium with a renewed sense of purpose. He knew that genuine dialogue would be crucial in overcoming the resistance he faced. As the days turned into weeks, Mark continued to attend community forums, steadily working to gain trust and support. The road ahead was rocky, but he believed deeply in the potential for change, not just for himself, but for all the communities he represented. With every conversation, he felt closer to the vision he had for a more just and equitable society. As the weeks progressed, the atmosphere in the state began to shift. Mark's commitment to reform was gradually earning him respect, even among his critics. However, the pressures of his position weighed heavily on him. Every decision felt magnified, scrutinized not only by the public, but also by political opponents eager to capitalize on any misstep. In the midst of this, Mark received an unexpected invitation. A local high school had decided to host a community event focusing on racial equality and police reform. The school's principal reached out, expressing a desire for Mark to speak. At first, he hesitated. Speaking to a room full of teenagers made him nervous. Yet he knew this was a prime opportunity to connect with the younger generation, who would inherit the future he was trying to shape. After some deliberation, he accepted the invitation. On the day of the event, Mark arrived at the school auditorium, where he was greeted by a sea of youthful faces. Students from various backgrounds were present, their expressions a mix of curiosity and skepticism. As he took the stage, he felt a rush of adrenaline. "Thank you for having me," he began, trying to gauge the room. "I know that many of you have strong feelings about the issues we're facing in our state. I'm here today to listen to you and to share what my administration is working on to create positive change." To his surprise, the students were engaged, asking thought-provoking questions that challenged him. One student stood up, her voice steady. "How can we trust the police if they're the ones who are supposed to protect us? But they hurt people who look like us?" Mark took a moment before responding. "That's a valid concern. Trust is earned, and I understand that many communities have faced historical injustices. It's my job to ensure that our police department acknowledges this and works to regain your trust. We're implementing training programs focused on racial sensitivity and community engagement." The conversation flowed organically, and he could sense the students beginning to connect with his message. The dialogue shifted from suspicion to curiosity, and Mark found himself inspired by their passion. He encouraged them to voice their ideas for change, empowering them to take ownership of their futures. Later in the evening, as the event concluded, several students approached him, sharing personal stories of encounters with law enforcement. Mark listened intently, his heart heavy with the weight of their experiences. "Thank you for sharing your stories with me," he said sincerely. "I want you to know that your voices matter. I will take your concerns back to my team and ensure that we work towards solutions together." This interaction left a lasting impact on Mark. He returned to his office energized, motivated to take actionable steps based on what he had heard. He called a meeting with his team, eager to discuss how to involve youth in the reform process more actively. "Let's create a youth advisory council," he proposed. "A group of students from different backgrounds who can help us understand their perspectives and suggest practical changes." Vanessa, Ever the strategist nodded enthusiastically. That's a great idea, Mark. It not only empowers the youth, but also fosters a sense of community involvement in the political process. Tom added, we should make sure it's representative of our state's demographics. We want to ensure all voices are heard. With renewed vigor, Mark and his team set out to establish the council. They reached out to high schools and colleges across the state, inviting students to apply. As applications flooded in, Mark felt a sense of hope. Engaging the youth would not only benefit his administration, but also cultivate the next generation of leaders. As the council took shape, Mark arranged a kickoff meeting to introduce the members to his vision. He wanted them to feel that their contributions were invaluable. On the day of the meeting, he stood before the group, excited to see so many enthusiastic faces. Welcome, everyone. I'm thrilled to have you here, he said, looking around the room. You are the future of our state, and I want to hear your ideas and concerns. Together, we can make meaningful change. The students were eager to contribute, brainstorming ideas for community outreach programs, public safety campaigns, and ways to bridge the gap between law enforcement and communities of color. Mark felt invigorated as he listened to their suggestions. One student, a young man named Jamal, spoke passionately about the need for mentorship programs. We need to connect younger kids with positive role models from our community, he explained. If they see people who look like them in leadership positions, it can change their mindset about what they can achieve. That's an excellent point, Jamal, Mark agreed. Mentorship can have a profound impact on young lives. Let's explore how we can implement this idea into our schools and community centers. The meeting lasted for hours, filled with vibrant discussions and innovative ideas. Mark was impressed by the maturity and insight of the students. He left the session with a notebook full of suggestions, feeling more hopeful about the direction his administration was heading. As the weeks rolled on, the Youth Advisory Council became an integral part of Mark's approach to reform. Their involvement not only provided fresh perspectives, but also strengthened the bond between his administration and the younger generation. Mark knew that change wouldn't happen overnight, but he was committed to fostering an environment where every voice mattered. Meanwhile, the incident with the police officers continued to reverberate throughout the state. A few weeks after the event at the high school, Mark found himself in the midst of a heated debate in the state legislature. His proposed police reform bill faced significant opposition, particularly from lawmakers who aligned themselves closely with law enforcement. During the debate, Mark stood at the podium, addressing the assembled lawmakers. This bill is not an indictment of law enforcement, but rather a step towards accountability. We cannot ignore the voices of our citizens who feel unsafe. Change is necessary, and I urge you to consider the future of our communities. The opposition was fierce, with many lawmakers arguing that his reforms would undermine police effectiveness. Yet, Mark stood firm, reminding them of the conversations he had with young people across the state. He spoke passionately about the need for transparency and trust. We cannot afford to allow fear to dictate our policies. Our communities deserve better. After a grueling session, the vote was called. Mark felt a wave of anxiety wash over him as he awaited the results. When the results were announced, the bill passed narrowly. Relief washed over him, but he knew this was just the beginning. As Mark left the chamber, he was greeted by a mix of cheers and discontent from his colleagues. He understood that this victory came with more challenges ahead. Returning to his office, Mark reflected on the journey so far. The road to reform was fraught with obstacles, but he felt bolstered by the support of the community, especially the youth. With each step, he was determined to honor their voices and drive the changes necessary for a more equitable society. With the passage of the police reform bill, Mark felt a renewed sense of purpose. However, he was also aware that this was not the end of the struggle, but rather a crucial stepping stone. The tension in the state was still palpable. Many citizens remained skeptical about the real change that would come from the reforms. The press had been relentless, scrutinizing every decision Mark made. He knew that to maintain public trust, he needed to show tangible results quickly. One evening, as Mark prepared for bed, his phone buzzed with a notification. It was a news alert about a protest scheduled for the following day, organized by a group of activists who believed the reforms didn't go far enough. They were demanding the resignation of the police chief, citing a history of misconduct. Mark understood their frustrations, having heard similar sentiments from the Youth Advisory Council. Despite his weariness, he felt a sense of responsibility to attend. These activists were the very voices he aimed to uplift, and ignoring them would only serve to widen the divide. The next day, he arrived at the protest site, a busy intersection in downtown, where chants filled the air, echoing the sentiments of a community eager for change. As he stepped out of his car, he was met with mixed reactions from the crowd. Some cheered, while others shouted criticisms, demanding more than just words from their elected leader. With his heart racing, Mark approached the makeshift stage, where several speakers were preparing to address the crowd. "Thank you all for being here," he began, raising his hands to quiet the crowd. "I understand your frustrations, and I am here to listen to you. I want to hear your concerns, and what more we can do to ensure that our communities feel safe and respected." The crowd simmered down, and a young woman stepped forward, microphone in hand. "Mr. Turner, we appreciate your presence, but we need action, not just words. What will you do to hold the police accountable for their actions?" Mark nodded, acknowledging her point. "I hear you. We are working on implementing oversight committees that will allow citizens to have a say in police practices. We are committed to training that emphasizes de-escalation and community engagement. But I know that trust is not built overnight." As he continued to speak, more people stepped forward to voice their concerns. Each story was unique, but shared a common thread of pain and mistrust. He listened intently, feeling the weight of their experiences. The more they spoke, the more determined he felt to enact real change. One protester, an older man with a steady voice, shared his story of being unjustly detained years ago. "I was taken in for no reason, and it shattered my faith in the system. We need to see real consequences for those who misuse their power." Mark felt a lump in his throat. "Your experience matters, and it's people like you who can help us move forward. I promise to fight for accountability in our police department and ensure that those who misuse their authority are held responsible." The crowd erupted in applause, and for a moment, Mark felt a connection with them. However, he also sensed the skepticism lingering in the air. He knew that promises were only as good as the actions that followed them. As the protest wound down, Mark was approached by Vanessa, who had been quietly observing. "You handled that well, but you need to follow up with concrete steps. They're looking for a leader who will stand by them, not just during protests but throughout the entire process." "You're right," he replied, feeling the pressure of leadership. "I need to set up regular meetings with community leaders and the Youth Advisory Council to keep the lines of communication open." That night, Mark sat in his office, deep in thought. The protest had energized him, but it also revealed the challenges ahead. The state was divided, and while the reforms were a step in the right direction, many believed they were not nearly enough. Determined to make progress, Mark convened a meeting with his administration team the next day. "I want to establish a series of community forums," he announced. "We need to engage directly with citizens to hear their concerns and suggestions. This is about rebuilding trust, and we can't do that without their involvement." Vanessa looked pleased. "That's a solid approach, Mark. Engaging directly with the community shows that you value their input. It might also help to dispel some of the skepticism." Tom chimed in. "We should also include law enforcement representatives in these forums to demonstrate transparency and foster dialogue between the community and the police." Mark nodded, appreciating the collaborative spirit of his team. They began brainstorming logistics, setting up a calendar for the forums to ensure they reached various neighborhoods across the state. As they worked late into the evening, Mark felt a sense of hope rekindling within him. They planned to kick off the forums in a week, and he was determined to make them a success. However, just as things were starting to feel optimistic, Mark received a call that would change everything. It was his assistant, Emily, her voice shaky. "Mark, we have a situation. There's been an incident involving the police and a group of protesters." His heart sank. "What happened?" "There are reports of excessive force being used. People are saying it's a clear violation of the reforms you just implemented." Panic surged through him. "Where did this happen?" "Downtown, right outside City Hall." Without wasting a moment, Mark raced to the scene. As he arrived, he was met with chaos. The protest had escalated, and officers were lined up in riot gear, pushing back against a crowd that was growing increasingly agitated. Mark felt a knot in his stomach as he saw the faces of people he had spoken with just days before, filled with anger and fear. He approached the front line, trying to make himself visible to both the police and the crowd. "Everyone, please calm down. I'm here to help," he shouted, though his voice was barely audible over the commotion. As he made his way through the crowd, he could hear snippets of conversations filled with outrage. "This is what we're talking about. Nothing is changing," one protester yelled. Mark's heart raced as he spotted a young woman who had been injured in the chaos, clutching her arm as she sat on the ground. "Someone call for medical help," he shouted, rushing to her side. "Mark, you shouldn't be here," Vanessa exclaimed, trying to pull him back. "It's not safe." "I can't stand back and let this happen," he replied, kneeling beside the young woman. "What's your name?" "Jessica," she gasped, tears streaming down her face. "I just wanted to protest for my rights, and they—" "Hold on, Jessica. Help is coming," he said, his voice steady despite the turmoil around him. He reached for her hand, squeezing it gently, trying to reassure her. Suddenly, an officer approached, his demeanor stern. "Governor Turner, you need to leave. This situation is under control." "Under control?" Mark shot back, his anger rising. "People are being hurt. I will not leave until everyone here is safe." The officer hesitated, clearly unsure of how to respond. Mark could see the tension in his body language, the conflict between following orders and recognizing the situation's gravity. Just then, a loud voice broke through the chaos. "Let him speak. He's our governor, and he's here for us." It was Jamal, standing defiantly among the protesters, rallying the crowd to support Mark. The words resonated, and slowly, the crowd began to quiet. Mark stood up, feeling the weight of the moment. "I am here to ensure that we can express our concerns peacefully. I promise to fight for your rights, but we cannot do this through violence. We need to find common ground." The tension in the air began to dissipate as the crowd listened, their anger shifting toward cautious hope. Mark knew this was a pivotal moment, not just for him, but for the community. As the police began to withdraw, Mark took a deep breath, realizing that this incident could either break or unite his administration and the people he served. He was determined to make it the latter. After the crowd began to disperse, Mark remained, speaking with Jessica until medical personnel arrived. He felt a sense of responsibility for the events that had unfolded and knew he had to address them head-on. Once Jessica was taken care of, he turned to Vanessa and Tom, who had been watching from a distance. "We need to hold a press conference. The people deserve to know the truth about what happened here today." "Agreed," Vanessa replied, her expression serious. "You need to address this right away." As the sun began to set, Mark found himself standing before a sea of reporters, cameras flashing. He took a deep breath, preparing to speak. "Today, we witnessed a troubling escalation that does not reflect the values of our community or the principles of the reforms I championed. We are committed to transparency and accountability, and I will ensure that a full investigation is conducted into today's events." He paused, looking into the cameras, knowing that this moment was crucial. "We cannot let this incident deter us from our goal of creating a safe and equitable environment for all. I stand with the citizens of this state, and together, we will demand better from our law enforcement agencies." With those words, Mark felt a surge of hope. The path ahead would be challenging, but he knew he was not alone. The support of the community, especially the youth, was a driving force in his fight for justice. As he concluded the press conference, Mark stepped away from the microphones, exhausted but resolute. He had to reach out to community leaders and ensure that they were involved in the discussions that would follow. Later that night, as he sat in his office reflecting on the day's events, Mark realized that the struggle for justice was far from over. But he felt a newfound strength in the connections he had made and the support that was growing within the community. Tomorrow, he would work even harder to bridge the gaps and ensure that the voices of the people were heard. After all, true change could only come from collaboration and understanding. The morning after the chaotic protest felt like a turning point for Mark Turner. As he sat in his office, sipping coffee, he reviewed the notes from the press conference and the messages of support that flooded in overnight. There was a renewed energy in the air, and he could sense that the community was ready for meaningful change. Mark's phone buzzed with a message from Vanessa. "Let's set up that community forum today. People want to talk." He quickly replied, "Let's do it. The sooner, the better." They scheduled the forum for the evening at a local community center, a space Mark had frequented during his campaign. He knew it was important to create a safe environment for dialogue where people felt heard. The team spent the day preparing, gathering supplies, and spreading the word on social media. By the time evening rolled around, the community center was buzzing with anticipation. People filled the seats, their faces a mix of hope and skepticism. Mark could feel the weight of their expectations as he stood at the front of the room, flanked by Vanessa and Tom. "Thank you all for being here tonight," Mark began, his voice steady but infused with urgency. "I know that trust has been broken, and it's my responsibility to help rebuild it. Tonight, I'm here to listen, to learn, and to work with you to create solutions that address your concerns." The room erupted in applause, and Mark felt a wave of support wash over him. But he also sensed the lingering tension. Many were eager to voice their frustrations. One by one, community members stepped up to the microphone. A young man named Elijah, who had been actively involved in the protests, spoke first. "We're tired of empty promises. You said you would hold the police accountable. But how do we know this time will be different?" Mark nodded, acknowledging his point. "I understand your frustration, Elijah. We are implementing oversight committees that will give citizens a voice in how our police operate. Your input is invaluable, and I want to ensure that these committees reflect the community's needs." Elijah crossed his arms, unconvinced. "We've heard that before. We want to see real action, not just committees that do nothing." "I get it," Mark replied, feeling the weight of the moment. "That's why I want to establish regular check-ins with you all. We'll create a timeline for the reforms and invite you to hold us accountable." As the night progressed, more voices emerged. A middle-aged woman, Rosa, shared her experience of feeling unsafe in her own neighborhood due to police presence. "How can we trust them when they don't protect us? We're scared of them more than the crime." Mark listened intently, recognizing the gravity of her words. "Rosa, I hear you. We're working to change the culture within the police department, but it requires collaboration with community members like you. Your safety is paramount, and we need to create an environment where everyone feels protected." The dialogue continued, and Mark felt a connection forming with the community. They were not just voices in a crowd. They were individuals with stories that needed to be shared. Each interaction made him more determined to create a system that prioritized their safety and trust. As the forum drew to a close, Mark encouraged everyone to stay engaged. "We'll have follow-up meetings and continue these discussions. Your voices will shape the future of our community, and I promise to be here every step of the way." Afterward, as people filtered out of the community center, Mark felt a renewed sense of purpose. He turned to Vanessa and Tom. "This is just the beginning. We need to make sure they see progress, not just hear about it." Vanessa smiled, her enthusiasm infectious. "You handled that well, Mark. People need to feel like they matter, and you're giving them that opportunity." Tom added, "We should prepare for more forums and set clear goals. The more transparent we are, the better." That night, as Mark lay in bed, he reflected on the day's events. The dialogue had been raw and honest, and he felt a sense of hope that was different from before. There was still a long road ahead, but for the first time, he felt like he was walking it alongside his community. The following days were filled with meetings and planning sessions. They finalized the timeline for the reforms, ensuring that each step was communicated transparently to the public. Mark also reached out to local media to provide updates and encourage dialogue. As the weeks passed, Mark noticed a shift in the community. People were more engaged, attending the forums and offering their insights. The energy in the air was palpable, and there was a sense that change was possible. However, he also knew that challenges lay ahead. Some factions within the police department were resistant to the reforms, and Mark had to navigate these tensions carefully. He scheduled meetings with the police chief and other officers to discuss their concerns while emphasizing the importance of community trust. One afternoon, as Mark reviewed reports in his office, he received an unexpected visitor, Chief Morgan, the police chief. "Governor Turner, I wanted to speak with you about the reforms. Some of my officers are apprehensive about the changes." Mark welcomed him in, sensing the weight of their conversation. "I appreciate you coming, Chief. What are your concerns?" Morgan sighed, running a hand through his hair. "It's not that we don't want to improve, but some officers feel like the reforms are undermining their authority. They're worried about being held accountable for situations that escalate quickly." Mark nodded, understanding the complexity of the issue. "I get that, Chief, but accountability is crucial for rebuilding trust with the community. The goal is not to punish, but to improve and protect everyone." Chief Morgan leaned forward, the tension in his shoulders easing slightly. "I want to support you, but we need to find a balance that works for both the department and the community." They discussed ways to involve police officers in the reform process, inviting them to share their perspectives and concerns. Mark proposed joint training sessions with community members, emphasizing the importance of understanding each other's experiences. As their conversation continued, Mark felt a shift in the room. Chief Morgan began to see that the reforms weren't a threat, but rather an opportunity for collaboration. They left the meeting with a plan to bridge the gap between law enforcement and the community, igniting hope for a new era of understanding. Weeks turned into months, and as summer approached, Mark stood at the front of a new community gathering, feeling a sense of pride. The energy in the air was electric as he addressed a crowd of supporters. "Together, we have made strides toward a safer and more equitable state. But we cannot stop here. This is a journey that requires our ongoing commitment." As he spoke, he noticed familiar faces in the crowd: Elijah, Rosa, and others who had shared their stories during the forums. Their presence reminded him of the work that lay ahead, but also the progress they had made together. As he concluded his speech, the crowd erupted in applause. Mark felt a surge of determination. The journey was far from over, but he knew that with the community beside him, they could create a better future. In the weeks that followed, the reforms began to take shape. The community forums continued, with more citizens getting involved, expressing their concerns, and celebrating the positive changes. Mark saw firsthand the impact of their collaborative efforts, a testament to the power of unity and understanding. Reflecting on his journey, Mark felt grateful for the challenges he had faced. They had forged a bond with the community, transforming pain into progress. With each passing day, he was more convinced that they were building a better future, one rooted in respect, trust, and a shared belief that together they could overcome any obstacle. As the sun set on another day, Mark looked out at the horizon, filled with hope. This was just the beginning of a new dawn for their state, and he was ready to face whatever lay ahead, hand in hand with his community.